let's bring you more now on a new development in the hostage crisis between Israel and Hamas that we learned of this afternoon. The Israeli Prime Minister has said that he has ordered his country's intelligence service, Mossad, who had a negotiating team, to withdraw from the hostage negotiations in Qatar. Well, it comes as the fighting intensifies and Israel's military calls for people in parts of southern Gaza to evacuate. Well, we can get more now on the situation on the ground from our military analyst, Sean Bell. Sean, first of all, that breaking news coming to us from the office of the Israeli Prime Minister doesn't bode well. Does it mean the end of the negotiations?
Almost certainly not, but as you say, it doesn't bode well. It's worth reflecting that the head of the US CIA and the head of Mossad were actually out in Qatar being the pointed end of the negotiations around this hostage situation. And now that Netanyahu's told them to withdraw, clearly that makes life very difficult in the near term for the negotiations. Netanyahu's clearly blamed Hamas. Both sides are blaming each other for the breakdown in this. But Netanyahu did recognise and thank the Qataris for their efforts to release 84 women and children and 24 foreign nationals.
Which in itself almost sounds quite final, doesn't it? It
does, but again, there's a lot of rhetoric around this and actually getting underneath it. Now, negotiations are always going to be difficult, but ultimately, despite the military action, it's the negotiations that have led to the release of hostages. But actually, it's worth remembering that Israel has two objectives here. One of them is hostages. The other one was destroying Hamas, and they've now modified their language. It's now destroying Hamas's military capability and their ability to govern. And the rhetoric, though, means that I think it seems from what Israel's doing is they're prioritising more now the destruction of Hamas rather than the hostages. I know that sounds harsh, but that's also been reflected in an escalation of military activity on the ground, as Ali Bunker reported earlier.
You know, I know that you love it when I put you on the spot. I'm just hearing in my ear that apparently President Macron, who is at the COP28 summit, has said that he will go to Qatar, presumably to have some influence over these negotiations. How significant is that?
I think we're going to see international pressure mounting on Prime Minister Netanyahu because from an international community perspective, they are massively focused on the hostages, particularly because there's still quite a number of foreign nationals held there. Without sounding ruthless, the Israeli defence forces that are currently held hostage, they're probably going to be the last category of hostages that get released. But there's quite a lot of others that are probably able to be negotiated, and therefore international pressure will be brought to bear. But every time we talk about negotiations, Hamas has sat at the table, and that will not please Israel because now they have a voice in this discussion, whereas when it's military activity, Hamas are just on the back foot. They have no vote in this at all. So every time the conversation drifts to negotiation, it starts to drift towards more humanitarian aid, potentially discussions about the end of the war. Even Kamala Harris and some of the US authorities are talking about what happens next in this conflict, who's going to rebuild Gaza, where's the money going to come from, who's going to control Gaza. And that can't be comfortable for Prime Minister Netanyahu, who can see the end, him being drawn inexorably to an end of the war when he actually hasn't achieved one of his primary objectives, which is to destroy Hamas's military capability and take them off the board. If you remember, part of it was to solve the Hamas problem. That's what he said, and it was impassioned words. So I think you're seeing a divergence now between the international community going, this is very brutal, versus Netanyahu not being finished yet.
International pressure also coming to bear on the military strategy, it would appear, because we're seeing evacuation orders coming from Israeli forces to people in Gaza, but very specific evacuation orders.
There is, and I think the context of this is important. If you remember, when the Israelis went to the north, they had huge casualties. In the south, it's actually, there's a lot more people, higher population density, and in Khan Yunis down the bottom, that's where they're going to have to focus. So the Israelis have given out leaflets. This is a whole massive number. It's very difficult to see, but it's the whole of Gaza. But if we zoom in now, if we look at what this means in detail, you can actually start to see what they've broken up is a grid factor. Now, we used to use this sort of thing in the military, particularly around special forces, because they would say we're operating in one of these grids, don't drop bombs in that grid. Now, you can do it by reverse as well. You can actually say all the population leave a certain grid square.
Which is what they've done in the last hour.
Correct. They've said leave grid squares. Now, that seems to be a bit of appeasing the US, who said you've got to do more to ease civilian casualties. Two problems with that approach, though, bluntly. The leaflets have a QR code on them. Gaza is not known for having a flourishing internet at the moment, or a mobile phone system that's running, or indeed power. So it's very difficult to see how you're going to communicate which particular grid square is going to be needed to be vacated and when. And the second concern with this, if I was a military going after Hamas, I wouldn't want to be telling Hamas where I was going and when I was going to attack them. So although the rhetoric seems powerful, in practical terms, it's very difficult to see how it's going to work.
All right, Sean, always fascinating to get your perspective. Thank you.